Good day, everyone, and welcome to the PECB webinar today. Our topic today is the CIA Triad in data governance, information security, and privacy, its role and its importance. Today's webinar is going to feature just yours truly. I'll be presenting this alone, but I will be arguing with myself a lot. Well, I'll definitely present some contrary views during the presentation. So today's webinar is covering the topic, as I said, of the CIA Triad. And the CIA Triad, as we all know, is relevant for anyone practicing information security, data governance, and privacy. And it's incorporated into several ISO standards, amongst other standards and frameworks. We'll also talk about the data governance versus information security versus privacy, and we'll roll through those definitions at the start of the presentation. And then we'll relate the CIA Triad to each of those topic areas, to data governance, information security, and privacy. And then we'll look specifically at how to implement and maintain the CIA model. I'm also going to throw in at that point some, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, some contrary points of view on the CIA Triad and its use within information security and cybersecurity in general. At the end of the session, we will have time for questions and answers. So you can certainly pose those questions in the chat window, and those questions will be collected up, and then we'll cover those at the end of the presentation. So a little about myself first. I'm a director of operations for Big Cyber. It's a relatively newly minted company, and we're based out of Las Vegas, but we have offices in Europe and in North America, and we cover customers across the globe. Our specialty is information security, cybersecurity, privacy, and we have advanced SOC SIEM services to complement our consulting services as well. So my role within that organization is helping our clients get secure and stay secure. So I mentioned at the intro section as well that the questions can be posed in the chat window, and those questions will be collected up, and we can cover those at the end of the presentation. For previous PECB presentations, there's a link in the slideshow, and you can get access to these recordings through that link. But I want to start today talking about the CIA Triad. And I put underneath of this, some people also refer to this as the CAI Triad for some obvious reasons here in North America, maybe not so obvious elsewhere, I guess. But the CIA is also an organization on my side of the Atlantic in North America, which is involved with security, I guess, but in a different way. So some people refer to this as the confidentiality, availability, and integrity triad rather than the CIA Triad. So you may hear that, especially for North Americans. I hear this quite a bit. But I'm going to stick with what's in the standards because I like following standards when I can. The CIA Triad. This is my own artwork, so thank you very much for your positive comments you're going to provide in the chat window on my drawing capabilities. I've built a three-legged stool here, if you didn't know what this thing was. And this is just showing confidentiality, integrity, and availability as the three legs that hold up the platform or the seat of data and asset security and privacy. I think it's important to not just talk about data, but also assets when you talk about CIA Triad, because I applied, and I'm sure everyone else does too, I apply this triad to not just my information, even though it's an information-centric triad, I also apply it to assets, including people assets and hardware assets, because it works on that level as well for me. So confidentiality is typically defined as finding a way to prevent unauthorized access to information that is deemed to be confidential or sensitive in nature. In addition to that, you'd want to include some kind of categorization of your information or your data or your assets, so a way to classify them so you understand which ones are confidential and which ones aren't. You're going to base that most likely on a risk-based process, a risk assessment-based process to assess the value and the sensitivity of information or assets. For integrity, you're trying to make sure that data that you're trying to protect or those assets you're trying to protect are trustworthy, so you know that they are what they're supposed to be and that you can rely on that. And you also make sure that the sources you're receiving communications from or information from are trustworthy as well. Integrity does extend out, in the way I apply this, it extends out to mechanisms for communication. So I want to make sure integrity is present in my information and my assets, and also in the communications and the sources. You'll often hear in that integrity leg, you'll hear people talk about a trusted source, or a trusted truth, or a trusted resource. And that's often a trigger for me that they're applying the CIA Triad. For availability, you want to provide access to those who should have access when they need access. So there can be times when access or availability might not be provided, say, after hours to certain types of information or to certain resources or systems or environments within the organization. So availability is that third critical leg of the CIA Triad. And on the right-hand side, I've popped in, of course, ISO 27001, which talks specifically to the CIA Triad as a mechanism for implementing that standard. So there's been quite a bit of talk lately about possibly replacing the CIA Triad. And this is usually coming from speakers at public events or people who are trying to get their name out there in the security field, I find, because really replacement isn't the right way to go with the CIA Triad. The CIA Triad still works perfectly in every security scenario that I've run into. But it could be that perhaps people aren't applying it broadly enough. The CIA Triad does include concepts of like non-repudiation, authentication, code validation, if you apply it correctly. For version 2.0 of the CIA Triad, people are talking about a new type of model, a new type of triad called DIE. And I put a link to this in the slideshow as well, so you can look this up yourself if you want more details. But the DIE triad is distributed, immutable, and ephemeral, and it's meant to apply specifically to infrastructure, whereas the CIA Triad was built around information as the asset to protect. The DIE Triad is built around infrastructure, making sure that the infrastructure is distributed so it's more resilient, making sure it's immutable and that the infrastructure could be readily replaced or rebuilt with other pieces if a part of it fails or it's compromised. And the infrastructure would be ephemeral, and that all assets would be disposable if breached. So it's the data assets aren't one and done copy of the information. It might be other copies. It might be that data is distributed across different infrastructure in pieces, so you can break one piece and not break the entire piece, the entire chunk of information or asset. But that DIE Triad, if you run into that conversation, it really complements the CIA. The two together would be a very powerful combination. But the CIA Triad will cover every scenario if you apply other principles along with it that come naturally from applying CIA. So a bit of coverage on the three core areas that we're looking to apply CIA: data governance, information security, and privacy. Data governance is mostly what people interpret ISO 27001's top level statements as being applied to it. They apply it to data governance, to the system of ISMS. But data governance is usually defined as a system for defining who has authority and control over data assets and the use of those assets. Now, in the case of ISO, there is an ISO standard, 38505-1, which speaks specifically to data governance. But 27001 also covers a governance model for your information security management system in the very top section of the standard itself when you look it over and read it. And that describes the engine for implementing security within your organization and maintaining that security infrastructure that you build. So it's like the engine for the entire set of Appendix A controls in 27001. In data governance, we're mostly interested and concerned about topics on the right-hand side. You can see people, process, and technology are all incorporated in data governance. You want to make sure that people are part of the solution for security. The processes that they might use or implement are also part of that. The technology utilized, so the IT side of it. It's not just about technology when it comes to information or cybersecurity, as we all know. The other two pieces are as critical as technology today. The compromising of a person, in fact, is the #1 avenue for attack on infrastructure and organizations today. Phishing attacks and ransomware attacks coming through phishing or coming through text messages or other methods for delivery, those are usually targeted at people first. And then ownership, accessibility, security, quality, and knowledge are all key concepts under data governance as well. So ownership, as we all know with assets, knowing what assets you have, especially information assets, isn't enough usually. You also need to know who is responsible for owning that asset, so that if someone wants to get access to that asset, they know who they're supposed to ask for the access from. It's not IT that owns infrastructure or data or assets. They're custodians of those tools for the organization. So usually, for example, if accounting has a bunch of files sitting on a file server somewhere, and I need access to some of those files or one of those files, IT really can't give me access. It has to come from the owner of the files, which would be, finance or HR, or whoever owns the content that I want to get access to. Accessibility, this is your access control, and also making sure that the data is available in the event of any kind of interruption. So your resiliency and all that stuff would fall under that heading as well. Security, of course, that's access control as well, but that's beyond that. That's making sure that the security is implemented in the infrastructure or against the asset is verified. It's got some kind of non-repudiation, some kind of method for ensuring who's trying to access it is who's supposed to access it, and other measures like that to protect it. The quality of the data as well is important, and making sure you understand what that quality is, what defines the quality, because if someone has gone in, let's say, and started to implant code or rootkits or something like that on your system, if you don't know what a good picture of those files looks like or what it should look like, you don't know what it looks like when it's been modified. So you need some kind of way to maintain the quality of the information of the assets. And then knowledge as well. So knowledge is part of data governance. Of course, you want to make sure people are aware of security and that they're knowledgeable in security within your organization. You don't just leave that to the security professionals. And then the topic of information security itself. This is obviously, as probably everyone on this call is aware, this is mechanisms for making sure you're protecting information or assets by mitigating risks, such as unauthorized access, unauthorized use, unauthorized disclosure, disruption of systems or data, modification that's unauthorized, and then destruction, of course. And today, as we all know, ransomware is a huge risk for all of us, a huge threat, I should say. And it's certainly a risk in organizations around the world as well. And ransomware, its goal is not necessarily every time just to encrypt your data and force you to pay ransom. In fact, some ransomware attacks are multi-level, and that they might encrypt the data, get the ransom from you, but in the meantime, they've exfiltrated the data as well, and then they'll publish it online. So there's lots of different concerns for information security even when it comes to dealing with what looks like a pretty straightforward attack, you have to be aware that that information may still be breached at some point in the future, or it may be part of a longer term breach process. So information security has to take all these different risks into account when you're trying to mitigate them. So on the people side, again, we're back to people, process, technology here. On the people side, we want to make sure that people are security awareness educated. So they're trained, they're kept aware of security. The one thing you don't want to do, of course, is overdo it. You don't want to use the FUD principle, where you're constantly bombarding them with fear, uncertainty, and doubt, because that really will create a numbness to security. So the security awareness program for the people side has to remain a bit nimble and keep people on their toes. Security duties have to be described and defined as well. So everyone has to know their own role in security, and also you need your specialists in security to understand their roles. And a big part of it as well is management awareness. So management has to be aware of security and what their responsibilities are in applying it. Third parties, this is a huge one now. Supply chain is a large scale threat for organizations because a lot of attacks are now coming through your third-party supply chain pieces, either by disrupting the supply chain or more likely by using that supply chain third party as a launch pad to attack your organization or to infiltrate it. So third-party security is part of the people security on my little wheel here, because I think it's important that third parties are as secure as your internal staff. And of course, around that people side, there's the insider risk as well, insider threat, which you have to keep in mind. Process. ISMS is required, information security management system, a set of security policy, standards, processes, something to guide security within the organization is going to be a critical piece of information security. Risk management is also important, and that's not just an IT function. In organizations where I've seen this applied incompletely, I've seen everyone concerned about the risks in IT and the technology side, but that really is not the whole picture. As you can see in this diagram even, you should be assessing the risks in your processes and your people and the risk to your business or to your function of your organization. So an organizational risk assessment is what I usually would look for when I go in to see if someone has weaknesses in their information security structure. I look to see if they've done an organizational risk assessment. They've assessed their business risks, and they have those in mind as well, because those often include security risks at some layer in them. On the technology side, of course, security controls for infrastructure, for facilities, and all that stuff is really important. It's not the only piece of the puzzle, obviously, as I said, but it is important. And staying current on those controls is important as well. As you may have heard today, actually, the rise in ransomware in an encrypted format is quite shocking. Ransomware is taking on a new attack methodology where it arrives encrypted, and you have to find a way to work around those kind of evolving threats and evolving risks. So on the technology side, there's always a continuous need for education, for updating, and for applying the latest in security techniques and technologies. My reference here at the bottom, of course, is to ISO 27001, where they talk quite a bit about this people, process, technology. On the privacy side, for privacy, I've quoted 27701 here. This is kind of a sort of an add-on to 27001. It's based on 27001, but as a standard, this can be very handy for putting in privacy controls that are ubiquitous and defined in such a way that they would meet other privacy requirements like regional or jurisdictional or legislative requirements like GDPR, and in Canada we have PIPEDA and some other ones as well. But the goals of privacy. Obviously, you want to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve a PIMS, a privacy information management system. Like the ISMS, the PIMS is a set of processes, a set of information, and a set of people requirements that help to drive your privacy program within your organization. A lot of organizations just write a privacy policy and figure that's it, we're done. But of course, as we probably all know by now, with requirements from structures like GDPR, from the New York Shield Act, from the Consumer Protection Act in California, the CCPA, you need more than that. You need processes around managing breaches, around detecting and reporting breaches, on incident management, on responsibilities to your customers, your consumers, and internal responsibilities as well for handling information like HR data, for example, on your staff. So there's a lot more to it than just putting in a privacy policy. A properly built PIMS is more holistic in nature, like an ISMS. The goal is to protect PII, personally identifiable information, and if you're doing things like credit card transactions, you might also be concerned about cardholder data, which is sort of a PII, but it's often referred to as PCI data for the PCI DSS standard. But at the very least, your PIMS should incorporate all of your privacy or your sensitive data that you're worried about protecting. On the left-hand side, I have a list of some of the high-level requirements that come out of a good PIMS program. Accountability, so making sure that your organization is accountable for the information they are custodian of, whether they're a processor or not. If you're holding data or you're transferring data across your systems or you're processing data, yeah, you're accountable for that information. A clear purpose for the information you do collect is important as well. So understanding that, and this goes back to the CIA Triad as well, making sure you understand the purpose for collecting information is important. If you're going to be retaining it or you're using it in any other way, you have to make sure that you're clear to your clients, to your consumers, and to anybody's personal data you're collecting, why you're collecting it and what it's going to be used for. Obtain consent. This has been a big one. With GDPR, this has really become, I've seen a global change on this for a lot of clients I've dealt with around the world, where before they might have been collecting information and assuming because the person who they're collecting it from logged into their website, or because the person they're collecting it from used their app, it's okay, they've got consent. But that isn't the case. In fact, you need to make sure you obtain consent. So you've got that express consent for that data to be collected. And there are other privacy acts in the world that also require a specific consent from the person you're collecting the data from, that they're okay with you collecting it. Limiting your collection to only that data that you need to collect is important as well. The use, disclosure, and retention of the data. Don't hold the data longer than you need to. Hold it for as long as you need to, and then securely remove it. Making sure the data is maintained to an accurate level, so that's part of the CIA as well. You're making sure the integrity of the data is good and solid. Protecting the data, so you're making sure that that's kept confidential. You're making sure only people, the only people who access it are people who should access it, and then making sure the owner of the data has access to it. That's not you, of course. You don't own that data you've collected. It belongs to the people that you collected it from, or the person you collected it from. So they have to have access to it to make sure that it's accurate, or to ask for it to be deleted, or to see exactly what it is you're collecting from them. So let's pull CIA directly into these three areas. For data governance, I've broken down C, I, and A on the left, and just taken a couple of the topic areas from each one of these just to show the examples of how to apply CIA to this particular realm, I guess, of information security, the data governance realm. So on the confidentiality side, I want to make sure that security is addressed and ownership is addressed for data governance. For confidentiality, the data kept secure, so only those who need access get access is important. But also you want to make sure that's described at the data governance level. So make sure that you've built that into your data governance model. If you're using a pre-built model for data governance, like the 38,000 series that I mentioned about, 38505, that helps to get you there. That will include the guidance you need and the information you need to get it done. Ownership, of course, as well, making sure you understand who owns the data at that level under data governance. that's how you make sure that either access is given correctly, or that anybody else trying to access the data understands that data belongs to the person. An example of PII, the person whose data was, who submitted that data to you, I should say, or shared that data with you. That gets a little bit tricky as well, and I'll mention this now. It gets tricky when you're dealing with third parties as well. If you've got data you've collected from your clients and you need to share it with a third party for some reason, you have to make sure that method and that linking for the sharing is A, authorized and approved by the owner, by the client, but B, it also has to be securely done. And you don't want to overshare the information. You share only what you need to, when you need to, as you need to, and for the reasons specified. And you make sure that that third party is also applying security principles like you are, and privacy principles like you are as well, to that data as they access it or utilize it. Integrity, the quality of the data, the knowledge would include a source of truth. This is what I referred to a few minutes ago. Making sure whoever is accessing that data understands that maybe the data from source A is your source of truth. There may be related data in source B, maybe another database, maybe another system, but that information in B isn't as accurate as information in A that they're trying to access. So you have to make sure everyone understands that source A is your source of truth, whereas source B may be processed from that, but it isn't the source of truth for the original data. That becomes really important as well. I mean, it's a dangerous little trap to fall into as you get into PII or things like GDPR. If you're dealing with client data that you've collected, it's PII data, and you've processed it a couple of steps or even just one step, and someone's relying on the second step for the source of truth, and that data is updated, but the actual source of truth is not. The client who owns that information, that PII data, when they look at the source of truth data, they may see it's not accurate. And that can be a problem for you under privacy law and privacy acts. Availability, so accessibility of the data is important as well. And I mentioned that in a third party way. You have to make sure it's only accessed by the people who need it the way they need it, as they need it, but also internally, of course. So let's look at information security. Defining your asset owners sounds familiar, I know, but this is really important on the confidentiality side in the CIA Triad. When it comes to information security, I need to know who owns what, and classifying the assets and assigning appropriate protection. So this is where risk management comes in on the confidentiality side. Make sure you risk assess your data and you've assigned the correct risk level to it or rating level to it, and you make sure that the people who need access can get it, but through appropriate protective mechanisms. So you're not just leaving the data hanging out there for anyone to access it, or the asset out there. You're making sure it's protected properly. Integrity, things like secure development life cycles. I do this all the time. I've written a few of these secure development life cycles for organizations, large to small. But if you're building bad code that's not secure and you're putting it out there for people to use, you're actually creating liability for yourself and making your product less reliable as well. So secure development life cycles, auditing and reviewing on the integrity of your systems and your processes, your data as well, making sure everything has been audited and reviewed on a regular basis. Availability, things like BCP and infrastructure stability are important here. On the privacy side, I've tried defining the asset owners again as the way to apply the confidentiality piece in privacy, classifying your assets again, and assigning appropriate protections. Now, this one would be pretty easy for PII data if PII data was defined the exact same way everywhere in the world, and unfortunately it isn't. And even within some types of PII data, even within some jurisdictions, within some countries, is defined differently. An example here in Canada is license plate numbers. In some parts of Canada, those are owned by the person who buys the license plate for life. They can put it on another car when they buy another car, and transfer the ownership of the license plate to that car. They still own it, but they can assign it to the car. In other provinces, the license plate is assigned directly to the vehicle and goes with the vehicle no matter who owns it in its lifetime until the car is destroyed. So there's different ways that plate data is considered or looked at as with regards to privacy within Canada. So it's a moving target when it comes to privacy when you're assigning appropriate protections to PII data. You have to make sure you understand the context of that information within your jurisdiction where you're applying privacy principles. For integrity, secure development, again, is going to be important. Auditing and reviewing is going to be important because the use of private data, PII data, and so on within your organization, it could be processed, let's say, it could be transferred, you might just store it, but typically there's some methodology you're employing when you get that data for using it for your business purposes, your organizational purposes. So that's what I mean by secure development, making sure those processes around that data and how you're processing it, how you're handling it, how you're managing, how you're transferring it are all up to snuff and that they've been securely built. Auditing and reviewing the data, and also things like the source of truth that I mentioned before, making sure you understand, especially if your business is evolving, how that information is going to be handled, managed through its life cycle. So you put together a little life cycle management process as part of your PIMs for that data, that PII data. And availability, we know that, as we mentioned before, the owner is supposed to have access to their data to verify, not only verify, but one thing to do is verify its accuracy. And that is going to be a bad day if you suddenly can't provide that access, or if that data is suddenly no longer available to you. It's been exfiltrated, let's say, and then ransomware on you, encrypted, and you can't get it decrypted. So making sure the information is available and accountable for it, you're accountable for it. Things like California's CCPA, it actually looks actively, and so does New York Shield Act. They look directly at how you can make sure that data is always available while you have it, how you can make sure it's always accounted for while you have it. If you can't find it, or if it's not available to you, you are going to be facing some problems on compliance. So this should look a little bit familiar to everybody on the call, I would think, by now. The PDCA loop here, Plan, Do, Check, Act. This is how you implement and maintain your CIA triad within an organization. Now you might see a pattern here. There's very short, quick, 3 or 4 step mechanisms used to drive information security within this infrastructure from 27001, for example, so that you can implement it quickly and easily and maintain it over time. There's people, process, and technology. That triad is what you apply your CIA to, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and you apply it with a process called Plan, Do, Check, Act. Now, this isn't everything you'll ever need to know or ever need to do, of course, but these are great building blocks for building a security program. Plan, Do, Check, Act is also mentioned in ISO 27001 in the intro section. But Plan, Do, Check, Act is implemented as well through NIST and other organizations as part of a methodology for putting in security. First, you plan your security. So you plan your infrastructure, your ISMS, your approach to security. That often involves doing a risk assessment and asset collection and all of that good stuff. Do is implementing. So you're putting in security mechanisms that have come out of your plan. So you're not just randomly putting in security. Probably the biggest bane of my existence in security these days is people who want to rush security and implement it fast or implement pieces and, oh, we'll fix it later. Usually the later never comes. You never get things fixed the way they should be. So making sure the do phase is based on your plan phase is really important. Even if things feel like you need to go 100% faster than you are, just take a breath, take your time, make sure you're approaching the situation, the security model, a security event, whatever it is you're handling in a clear-minded and structured way. Checking what you've done as well. So checking would be like auditing, testing, reviewing, anything like that that would support review of your security implementation against both what you planned, but also against the current threat landscape. because this is where you can actually get benefit from the check phase. If you're assessing against just what you planned and nothing else, your plan is going to be written in stone. It won't update. If you check against what you've written, but also against what current threat landscape indicators might tell you you should be looking for, then that act phase that comes next is going to be very handy. In that act phase, you're going to take your check results and you're going to see what it is you need to do to either improve or expand or maybe mature your security plan and security implementation. For CIA, this is really important as well, because this whole mechanism that goes back to plan again after act, this whole mechanism can help to keep your CIA implementation fresh. It can keep it matured, it can keep it growing and expanding. Maybe not necessarily expanding in a growth way, but expanding in a maturing way. So it becomes far more functional for your organization over time. You go back to the plan phase because after doing the do, check, and act, you may find that, yeah, we have to revisit some of our plan and we should look at improvements. We should look at ways to strengthen it and maybe make it more relevant for today's threat landscape. I popped a few information sources here at the end of the slideshow. I just want to talk through a couple of these. I mentioned this earlier on. I actually saw this topic for the first time at a Black Hat conference out of Vegas, and it was presented online during the pandemic. And someone was making the argument, and it seemed more sensationalized than they were actually making it out to be. But they were saying that CIA Triad was dead and it should be replaced with a DIE Triad. Remarkably enough, that spells die, which also sounds like dead, but that isn't what they were trying to do. But the DIE Triad, as I mentioned, is focused more on infrastructure. And if you look it over and get into the details of it, you'll see it feels sort of like a NIST-driven initiative, sort of like something that would be used to drive NIST SP 800-53, which is far more applied IT security. In that respect, it probably works really well in that kind of a model. However, the CIA Triad really wouldn't be replaced by this. As I mentioned earlier, the CIA Triad would be complemented by it. If anything, it would be enhanced. So you'd have some kind of more specific IT style security model to use in addition to your CIA Triad. I'll put a link in here as well, talking about the CIA Triad and ransomware. People are actually taking the CIA Triad and applying it to current cyber threats like ransomware. So I wanted to share that article because it was an interesting read, and it talks about how the CIA Triad can help you in these ransomware days. Some best practices as well. These both come from Security Boulevard's not bad topics on there sometimes, so I thought I'd share that one. And then a description of the CIA Triad from CSO Online. And CSO Online is a good general read. It's quick read content, but it's interesting stuff. And that can, if you need a quick read for your executive level on the CIA Triad, you can get some good tips from those types of articles from CSO Online. Okay, that concludes the core of my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Anthony, for delivering this very informative webinar. PCB offers training and certification courses which will show your dedication in implementing and managing business continuity and privacy-related frameworks, and most importantly, you will get recognized worldwide. Now, without further ado, we will go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees. And let's start with the first question, which is regarding the risk assessment. Do we have to measure the impact on asset based on the CIA Triad?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I definitely would. A good risk assessment, especially when you're talking about applying a CIA Triad approach, a good risk assessment should include impact for certain. And it should also include, if you can do it, if you can quantify that impact in some kind of a way, meaningful way. I know you can do risk assessments that are qualitative or quantitative, and it's up to you which one works better for your situation. There's guidance on qualitative versus quantitative, but for impact, I like to try to get as quantitative as I can when I talk about impact on assets. For example, I may say in the risk assessment, if this data is lost or unavailable for X amount of time, this is a dollar value impact to the organization if it's dollar driven, or this may be the process level impact. So it may be that not having that data means you can't do the processing you're normally doing that data. That really works very well for communicating risk to business, to stakeholders. People who are not security professionals, maybe not even technology professionals, maybe the senior management, the board, they understand it when you can put it in a quantitative type of term for them. They're happiest when they can get the impact in that way.
Thank you, Tony. The next question is, can you please elaborate slightly more on source of truth?
Sure. I run into this all the time. Typically in privacy conversations, to be honest, with privacy professionals. One example of this would be a conversation I had, and I can't name names, of course, but a conversation I had with an organization, a government organization, and they're a pretty sizable government organization, and their privacy professionals were on a call with me, and we were talking through this third party they were going to use for processing data. This third party was providing service via a website where you could go in and review your court cases that you're involved in, and hopefully not too many of those for anybody in this call at a time. And in that case information, you would have information from both sides of the fence, from the lawyers on the plaintiff side and lawyers on the defendant side, and that information may or may not be up to date between the two sources. So you had to have a source of truth of that information. And the source of truth in this case was a specific database that was owned and controlled by the Department of Justice in this case, in that jurisdiction. And that source of truth was the only source of truth. So no matter what either side of the court case argued, the information that was accurate was the stuff that was in the possession of the DOJ. So that's an example of a source of truth that has to be accurate. Now, with regards to PII, if I'm a plaintiff or a defendant in that case, my source of truth is really important to me, because that's what my judge in my case is going to be using to make the decision. So I want to make sure that source of truth is accurate and up to date. So whatever I've submitted for information has to be accurate somewhere, and that source of truth is critical in that case.
Thank you, Tony. The next question is, could you explain more on how data protection is linked with data governance and privacy?
Sure thing, yeah. So for data governance level, data protection for me at the data governance level, I'm thinking about making sure that my systems I'm putting in place for security, for sustainability of my infrastructure, for protection of data, that all those systems are following some kind of a methodology for protecting the data within my infrastructure. Now, that data may be data that I own, it may be data that I'm custodian of, maybe it's client data or third-party data, perhaps from my partners. So the mechanisms at the data governance level, I'm looking for some kind of processes around managing, handling, maintaining, processing that data. So I'm looking for information that would show me that there's repeatable, reliable processes, procedures, protections around that information. On the privacy side, I'm really concerned about a bit more than that. I'm concerned not only about my own mechanisms, but I'm looking at specifically how that information is protected for the consumer, or for the owner, the actual owner of the data. With data protection at that privacy level, I'm looking to make sure that that data is encrypted if it's at rest, because it's PII, if I'm talking about privacy. It's encrypted while it's in transit, and it's encrypted or handled correctly or securely while it's being processed. Now, if it's something like, let's say, a third party helping me with the processing side, because maybe I'm just a custodian holding the data, and then it's processed by someone else. If it's a third party processor, I'm as responsible for that data, whether it's a third party processing it or me. I'm still on the hook for it as the person that collected it, the organization that collected it. So I also look at data protection in the flow of the information to third parties, and then how they're dealing with it as well while they have it or use it or access it. So it gets quite a bit bigger on the privacy side.
Thank you, Tony. The next question is, why is ransomware increasing?
Yeah, it makes money. That's one reason. It's also readily available as a tool set through dark web sources. You can go online today. Don't do this, but I have gone online from secure systems into the dark web, and there's a lot of protective measures you need to take before you try this to protect yourself. But I've gone in the dark web and gone on boards, they call them boards, but like a site that offers services where I could purchase different levels of ransomware kits. I could even purchase a turnkey system. So I wouldn't even have to deploy the ransomware. I just tell them the targets I want to hit, and a team from this service provider would then provide the service of launching the ransomware, and they get a percentage of whatever comes out of it for payment, or whatever data is extracted or exfiltrated. They want to share the sale of that data. So there's different ways you can do it today that are very, very easy. I might have zero technical capabilities. I might just be good at picking targets. Or I might have some other skill set, I guess, for deploying ransomware that I want to enhance by using someone else to help me out. So it's very easy to do. It does make money. The protections against it are still catching up. I've seen some great improvements in the protective measures against ransomware. A lot of it comes down to people, though. You have to make sure your people are kept aware of it and kept as secure as your data is. So people have to be aware of what the risks are around ransomware.
Thank you, Tony. The next question is, what should be the top priorities regarding the confidentiality topic within a data warehouse?
Yeah. So especially if you're storing your data with any third party in any format, whether you call it a data warehouse or a cloud service provider or whatever, I would want to make sure that whatever security mechanisms they have available to me, I want to know which ones I actually have with whatever service level I've purchased from them, and which ones are optional that I have to pay extra for or add or take on myself. One quick way to do this is, one thing I like to do is build a RACI when I'm dealing with any third-party data storage solution. I like a RACI chart, so that defines the responsibilities, the accountability, and all those pieces around who does what in a table for me. That tells me what protections the third party is providing to me, what protections I have to make sure I'm taking care of, or what mechanisms of the protections, and then what service level I've purchased versus what might be available to me if I pay more money for more protections. It's really important to get that all clarified before you sign that contract. And even after you sign it, go back to your third-party data warehouse or third-party cloud provider, whoever it is, and run through the questions with them. Ask them those questions so you have that documented somewhere.
Thank you, Tony. And the last question for today would be, what is the best way controls can be embedded, measured, and assessed in an organization?
Yeah, good question. There's a lot of focus today on key performance indicators, indicators of compromise, and all these other neat terms for basically boiling it down to watching what you've done and measuring what you've done over time. Putting controls in place or putting them on paper doesn't mean they're actually operationalized. So what I like to do is I try to make sure that I have, with every control I put together, some kind of a measure to measure A, how effective that control is over time. B, how I might improve it, if there's any opportunity to improve it. And then C, how I can report on it. So I want to make sure that I can go back and measure what I'm trying to put in place over time, in essence. And the reporting on it might not be just for my benefit. It's usually for management benefit, but also for the benefit of the portion of the organization that actually implemented and owns that control. Because as a security professional within an organization, I should not own the security controls. I should be helping to get them made, built, designed, implemented, whatever, but they really shouldn't belong to me. If I'm putting, for example, security controls on a database, that database owner or the owner of the data in that database would be responsible for that control. So if I see a need to get an improvement put in that database on the security side, I'll make the recommendation. Then it has to be implemented, then I can measure it. That gives me a bit of a third-party kind of approach, or four eyes approach, where I don't own what I've built necessarily all the time. I might own it sometimes, but most of the time, the data owner, the system implementer should be the owner of that control I put in place.
Thank you, Anthony, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Please be informed that this session is recorded and will also be posted on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. Thank you very much one more time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.